And along the way, we'll take a comprehensive tour of the city. I'll start with a brief overview of Valencia's place in the world today before going back to its origins. The population is about 800,000, making it Spain's third largest. And if we add in suburban and satellite communities, the population of the wider metropolitan area is around 1.5 to 2 million, which again is Spain's third largest. Here are some of the landmarks that we should look at. The green strip there is the dry riverbed created when the river U3A was diverted to the south of the city in the 1960s. In the oval there, picked out in the blue dots, you can see the jumble of streets that made up the medieval city. Soon after Spain became a democracy with the death of Franco in 1975, the country's 50 provinces were grouped into 17 autonomous communities, to each of which a range of powers was devolved. Made up of 3 provinces, the Valencian community is one of the 17. Valencia is the capital, and this building is the seat of the regional government. It was begun in 1421. The tower at this end is 16th century. The far one is a modern replica completed in the 1950s. With a major port, Valencia is an important commercial center. In terms of overall tonnage, it's the second largest port in Spain after Algeciras. But for container traffic, it's #1 in Spain and #5 in Europe. Britain's #1, for context, Britain's #1 is Felixstowe, and that's #9 in Europe, quite a bit smaller than Valencia. Of course, a large proportion of the workshop, as in any major city, work in one of the many branches of the service sector. There is a significant manufacturing sector. The Ford assembly plant to the south of the city, for example, is a major employer. And ceramics have been important to Valencia for centuries, from patio tiles to the finest porcelain and everything in between. This remarkable building in Valencia is home to Spain's National Museum of Ceramics. It opened in 1954. It was Gothic when it was built in the 15th century and took on its present over-the-top Rococo style, what it's called, in the middle of the 18th century. The elaborate main portal that you can see on the right there is carved alabaster. As well as commerce, services, and manufacturing, lying at the center of a fertile agricultural belt, the city has an important food processing and export industry. Now, Valencia began with the Romans, who first landed at Spain at Ampurias in 218 BC. And that wasn't because they wanted a holiday on the Costa Brava. They were at war with the Carthaginians, who controlled a good deal of territory in Spain, governed from the capital, Cartagena, or New Carthage. And the Roman mission was to remove the Carthaginians, a task which they completed in just 12 years at the Battle of Ilipa near present-day Seville in 206 BC. The Romans subjugated the whole peninsula over the next 200 years, defeating a patchwork of Iron Age tribes. Lusitani in the west were particularly difficult under a king called Viriatus. Lusitanian wars lasted 15 years and ended with the defeat of Viriatus in 139 BC. In the following year, 138 BC, the Romans rewarded 2,000 veterans of the Lusitanian Wars with plots of land in and around a new city on the Spanish Mediterranean coast. Built for the valiant, they called it Valentia. It occupied an island bounded by the main loop of the river U3A to the north and a secondary channel to the south. The lower part of this picture, taken from the top of the bell tower, represents the central part of the Roman city, the Forum. One of several civil wars fought in the Roman world in the 1st century BC took place in Spain between the forces of Pompeius and Sertorius. Pompeius, also known as Pompey the Great. Valentia sided with Sertorius and paid the price when Pompey, the eventual winner, destroyed the city in 75 BC. There was a revival in the following century and a peak in the 3rd century, but it was never a particularly important city, very much secondary to Sagunto, a little way to the north, and Denia, not far away to the south. With the decline of Rome in the 5th century, a number of invaders came from the north. The Visigoths entered Spain in 415 and turned out to be the dominant group, ruling most of Iberia from their capital, Toledo, and they held Valencia from 497. Moors, Berber tribesmen led by a small number of Arabs, invaded from Morocco in 711. They conquered most of the peninsula within a decade and established their capital in Cordoba, and Valencia fell to them in 718. In the early years, Moorish Spain was chaotic. Order came with Abd al-Rahman I, who led a coup in 756 in Cordoba, establishing a dynasty that would last 300 years. Valencia resisted, and he destroyed the city in 778, the second time the city had been destroyed. It was soon rebuilt and prospered, with an economy based on farming of the rich irrigated land surrounding the city, and the crops the Moors introduced included citrus fruit and rice, which of course are emblematic features of the landscape around Valencia today. The city was walled by the Moors in the 11th century and had a population of about 15,000, 3 times that of the Roman city. And partly as a flood control measure, they eliminated the southern branch of the river, and Valencia was no longer an island. This was a period of splendor, funded by a booming trade in paper, fabrics, ceramics, glass, and silverware. Moorish control of Valencia came to an end briefly in 1094, after a long siege by El Cid. He was a mercenary who would fight for anyone against anyone, Christian or more. He held Valencia in the name of Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon. In reality, it was a personal fiefdom, but it was very deep in Muslim territory, and he was unable to hold it. He died during a Moorish siege of Valencia in 1099. His wife Jimena was able to hang on for another 3 years. But in 1102, Alfonso led an evacuation of the city, torching the key buildings on the way out, third destruction of the city. But over the next century and more, the city recovered and further Christian attempts were made to recapture it. All of them failed until Jaime I of Aragon succeeded after a 5-month siege on October the 9th, 1238, a date which we now celebrate every year in this region as Valencia Day. Jaime was obsessed with Valencia, describing it as, quote, the most beautiful land in the world. He spent 15 years planning its capture and led an international army which had been swelled by the result of the Pope's designation of the venture as an official crusade. Most Moors chose to leave. Others moved to what became known as the Moorish quarter outside the walls to the west. There was a small Jewish population restricted to the east end of the city, southeast corner, and confiscation of Moorish property created 1,600 homes for immigrants who came from a wide area, including many from France. Mosques were converted to churches. Valencia Cathedral was begun in 1262 on the site of the Great Mosque. The Moors built a royal palace surrounded by gardens in the 11th century. It was remodeled by Jaime and his successors for more than 500 years until the Peninsular War began in 1808. As Napoleon's troops were approaching, the city destroyed the palace to prevent it being used as a base for French guns. All traces of the palace have gone, and the area is now Valencia's largest park. With the capture of Valencia from the Moors, Aragonese and Catalan nobles wanted to absorb the territory into their own lands. Instead, Jaime made Valencia a kingdom, a sovereign state within a federation, the Crown of Aragon. So the Kingdom of Valencia was on a par with the Kingdom of Aragon and the County of Barcelona. And at its height, the Crown of Aragon was a much more extensive federation than just the 3 territories on the Spanish mainland, covering much territory in the Mediterranean. In the 14th century, a new city wall was created, leading to a 3-fold increase in the size of the enclosed area. It was designed to encompass new suburbs and to protect commercial activity, and the threat of war with Castile was the primary trigger. An inconclusive war did materialize and ran for 20 years from 1356. Valencia, thanks to the new wall, repelled attacks by Castile twice in the 1360s. 2 of the 9 gates in the 14th century wall remain, Torres de Cart and the Torres de Serranos. The Serranos towers are a heavily restored Gothic structure built at the end of the 14th century. The Cart towers are scars from 1808, at the start of the Peninsular War, when the city was under siege by Napoleon's troops. The 15th century was a golden age. In terms of economic and cultural affairs, the Kingdom of Valencia led the federation. Alfonso V of Aragon, who was Alfonso III of Valencia, loved the city, and he was married there in 1415. He moved the court to Valencia from Barcelona in 1424, and he himself spent much of his time in Naples, leaving his wife as regent. And because of that Naples connection, Valencia became the Spanish point of entry for the artistic and cultural trends of the Italian Renaissance. And it was a commercial center as important as Venice, Genoa, and Marseille. Important developments were made to the cathedral in the 15th century. The dome and the bell tower, known as Miguelete, were finished, and the nave was extended. Miguelete was completed in 1418, and the name was given to the largest bell because it was blessed on St. Michael's Day in 1418. The present bell dates from 1532, and there are 12 in total. This is the view from Miguelete, looking north to the Serrano Gate. To the northeast, across the cathedral's dome. The southeast to the City of Arts and Sciences and the port. And this is the view to the south across the Plaza de la Reina, and that entire area is being turned into a pedestrian-only zone as I speak. And southwest to the Central Market and La Lonja, the Silk Exchange. The Silk Exchange is where silk was bought and sold. The building is an outstanding example of Spanish civic Gothic. It was begun in 1481. No expense was spared. It took 15 years to complete. This was the main trading hall. In a separate wing, this meeting room has an extraordinary floor and ceiling. 200 years ago, you wouldn't have seen many oranges in the Valencia area. Instead, there were broad vistas of white mulberry trees because silkworms have a voracious appetite for their leaves. Silk production began in China about 5,000 years ago, and the practice was brought to Spain by the Moors. The silkworm is a caterpillar, cute little creatures, aren't they? It wraps itself in a strand of silk 300 to 900 meters long, creating a cocoon from which a moth will escape, therefore ruining the silk. To prevent that happening, just before the moths are due to appear, the cocoons are boiled. Several threads are spun together to make yarn for weaving, and in the 15th century, when the Lonja was built, there were thousands of looms in Valencia and the surrounding countryside. The industry peaked in the mid-19th century, but fell off a sharp cliff with the arrival of a parasite that attacked the silkworm. There were other factors, including underinvestment, increased competition, and the rise of cotton. Oranges came to the rescue. The silk industry does survive on a very much reduced scale using imported yarn, and weavers continue to make high-end cloth for the traditional costumes used in fiestas. The silk exchange played a role in the Spanish Civil War. In November 1936, the Republic moved the government from Madrid to Valencia. Almost a year later, it moved on to Barcelona. But while Valencia was the capital, Parliament met in the Silk Exchange building. Here's another building that was concerned with an important commodity in the 15th century, the Almudene, where wheat was bought, sold, stored, and distributed. Frescoes dealing with aspects of wheat production and trade and with associated religious themes were recently restored. Major changes occurred in the late 15th century with the merger of the crowns of Castile and Aragon, when Fernando II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile married in 1469. With the discovery of the New World in 1492, the focus shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Castile became increasingly dominant, and Fernando showed less interest in Aragon. Valencia and Barcelona were run by a succession of viceroys who were not local people, and they promoted the Castilian language and greater integration with Castile. The University of Valencia was established in 1502 in what had been the Jewish quarter, where land became available cheaply following the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. The original location of the university is still used as the seat of the rector and has a library of rare and ancient books, and formal ceremonial events still take place here. The cloister was begun in 1840. Colegio del Patriarca, a seminary founded in 1583 by a pious aristocrat, Archbishop Juan de Ribera. It was built next to the university so that seminarians could easily attend relevant classes at the university. The cloister is one of the finest in the Spanish Renaissance style, using marble columns from Genoa. The statue of the patriarch is by Mariana Benliure, whom we shall get to know much better later on. In the Patriarca, an impressive art museum includes A-listers such as El Greco and Caravaggio. I took this picture on an art society trip in October 2017. It includes the late and much loved John Wilde doing one of the things that he did extremely well. That trip was run by Dodie and James Hodgkinson, who I think are listening to this right now. This statue of Cervantes is also by Benliure, with Don Quixote holding a bust of his creator. It was installed in 1905, the third centenary of the publication of the first volume of Don Quixote. Writing about Valencia around the turn of the 17th century, Cervantes had a very, very favorable view of the city. Speaking of visitors, he said, no one had to tell them of the grandeur of the place, of the excellence of its inhabitants, the pleasantness of its environs, and finally, all that which made it beautiful and rich above all other cities, not only in Spain, but also in all of Europe. And principally, they praised the beauty of the women and their extreme cleanliness and charming language. Beautiful, well-spoken women with the highest standards of personal hygiene. It doesn't get much better than that, does it? Late in the 17th century, a number of churches were built or remodeled in the Spanish Baroque style. The Basilica of the Virgin of the Forsaken, patron saint of the city, was built next to the cathedral between 1652 and 1667 on the site of a Roman temple. The church of Santa Catalina dates from the 13th century on the site of a mosque. Built following a fire, its bell tower is late 17th century. The cathedral's concave facade was completed in 1703. The 18th century began badly. The last Habsburg king, Carlos II, died childless in 1700 and passed the crown to a French prince, his sister's grandson, who became Felipe V, the first Bourbon king. Crucially, he was also a grandson of the French king, Louis XIV. The English, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the Austrians didn't like that arrangement, which had the potential for uniting the crowns of Spain and France. They proposed an alternative, Archduke Charles of Austria, and each of the two had a good bloodline, being the great-grandson of a Spanish king. The resulting conflict you'll remember from your school days is the War of the Spanish Succession, where Valencia and Aragon and Barcelona backed the wrong side, coming out in support of Charles. A decisive victory for Felipe at the Battle of Almansa in 1707, just 100 kilometers to the southwest of Valencia, quickly led to the city's surrender. Felipe's control of Valencia was assured by the conversion of barracks at the northeastern corner of the wall into a citadel, with 16 guns pointing at the heart of the city. Felipe abolished the charters and privileges of Valencia. The silk exchange became a garrison until 1762. New taxes were levied and laws were harmonized with those of Castile. Officials were appointed, not elected, often French aristocrats. And use of the Castilian language was encouraged. Despite all that, important infrastructure developments were made later in the 18th century. And in 1802, the University of Valencia's Botanic Garden, which had focused on medicinal herbs, moved to its present location. Today, in addition to being a center for research and teaching, you can stroll among the 4,000 living plant species, which include 350 different trees. Soon after the Botanic Garden was relocated, the Peninsular War began with Napoleon's invasion in 1808. And as I said earlier, the Royal Palace on the opposite side of the river from the city was destroyed to prevent it being used as a platform from which the French could bombard the city. Valencia was able to beat off 2 attacks early in the war, in June 1808. However, it later came under siege by Marshal Suchet, and after 2 months with little food and obsolete defenses, Valencia was captured by the French in January 1812 and became an important base for the French for the remaining 2 years of the war before the French were defeated and the Spanish monarchy was re-established. Later in the 19th century, there were further infrastructure developments, and in 1865, the wall was pulled down. In the 1870s, there was a rebirth of Valencian cultural traditions, including reinstatement of the language. In the 1860s, there were 3 important births within a 5-year period. There must have been something special in the water. Valencia's greatest painter, Joaquin Sorolla, her greatest sculptor, Mariano Benlliure, and her greatest writer, certainly of the modern era, Vicente Blasco. All 3 of these busts, including the self-portrait, are the work of Benlliure. Sorolla was responsible for portraits, landscape, work on social and historical themes. He portrayed sunlight and the people of his native land. And of course, he did a lot of work in Javea, probably including that one on the bottom left. In 1899, Sad Inheritance was a prize-winning portrayal of a group of disabled kids. and the provinces of Spain were commissioned by the Hispanic Society of America. 14 large canvases painted during the 1910s, celebrating landscape and culture of Spain. Today they hang in the Society's premises in New York City. Benlliure's ambition was to be a painter until he went to Rome in 1879. Michelangelo's work convinced him to sculpt. He was prolific and dealt with an enormous range of subject matter. He was responsible for many public monuments, including Alfonso XII in Madrid's El Retiro Park, Goya in front of the Prado, and the first Marqués de Campo in Valencia, the city's mayor in the 1840s. Sorolla and Benlliure are both well represented in the Museum of Fine Arts in Valencia, which was inaugurated in 1945 in a 17th century building. The Valencia Institute of Modern Art opened its doors in 1985 for post-1900 painting, sculpture, drawing, and photography. Blasco was a journalist, novelist, and Hollywood screenwriter. He was a political activist on the side of the poor, anti-church and anti-landowner, and his early novels deal with aspects of rural life around Valencia. His masterpiece was set in and around the Albufera. The Albufera is a small lake with an area of 30 square kilometers. It used to be a much larger marine lagoon that was closed off from the sea by sand dunes as recently as the 16th century. It's owned by the city. It's an important wetland and has been fished since the Stone Age. Marshal Suchet, the guy who captured Valencia for Napoleon, was rewarded with a dukedom. He became the Duke of Albufera, and the title still exists. And right now, there's a French aristocrat swanning around as the 7th Duke of Albufera. If he ever visits the Albufera, I hope the locals will have the good sense to drown him in it. Rice and tourism are important, and these A-frame houses are characteristic of the area. I love this graphic design work, a postage stamp struck in 2017 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Blasco's birth. In the middle of the 19th century, the obsolete 14th century wall was still there. Beginning in 1865, it was removed to make way for a ring road. The timing was influenced by the need to create jobs for displaced silk workers. In 1867, the plan for the ensanche, or expansion, was proposed, inspired by a similar plan in Barcelona. From 1877, Stage 1 was executed in the yellow area, and from 1907, Stage 2 was completed. The turn of the 20th century was the heyday of modernist architecture. While not on the same scale as in Barcelona, there is quite a lot of it in Valencia. On Calle de la Paz, for example, color, wrought iron, and plant motifs. And on the Casa de Punt de Gancho, next to the cathedral, flowers, leaves, stylized tree trunks. Built between 1906 and 1917, the main train station was one of several public buildings done in the modernist style. There's lots of color and vegetation highlighting oranges. And inside, there's a great deal of elaborate mosaic work. In the tiled hall at the west end of the concourse, there are representations in tile of Valencia's rural surroundings. The space occupied by the central market has been a marketplace since the 13th century, and it's also had other functions. hosting festivities, parades, proclamations, executions, tournaments, bullfights, and so on. But the idea of a fully covered market was first proposed in 1882. Eventually, work began in 1910, and the market was finally inaugurated in 1928, incorporating a great deal of ironwork, ceramics, glass, and color. It's one of the largest markets in Europe, with 400 stallholders and covering over 8,000 square meters. The dome is outstanding with a span of 30 meters. Built a little earlier than the central market, the smaller Mercado Colón was completed in the Ensanche in 1917. It has a center section with a roof and an open section on each side with an awning. And there's a fine modernist facade featuring scenes from rural life. No longer a market, it has recently been restored and extended below ground for restaurants, artist stalls, and car parking. Here are two photographs looking south across the Plaza del Ayuntamiento, with City Hall on the west side facing the post office on the east side. The huge town hall was begun in 1905, a revival of the Baroque style with neoclassical elements. The post office and telegraph building is on the opposite side of the square from the town hall. It was built between 1915 and 1922 with two cupolas and an iron tower. There are 5 figures representing the continent, 3 angels with a train and 3 more with a ship. If airmail had been developed, no doubt space would have been found for an aircraft and 3 more angels. And there's a remarkable elliptical glass dome above the 2-story main hall. Valencia's main fiesta is, of course, the Fallas, which reaches a climax on March the 19th, St. Joseph's Day. Structures like these, which take all year to make, are set up in the street in the few days leading up to the 19th, when they are burned. Over 300 neighborhoods in Valencia have one. They usually have a sharp satirical focus, and traditionally are made from wood, cardboard, papier-mâché, and cloth. These days, there's a disturbing amount of styrofoam used. The fiesta began in the Middle Ages, carpenters celebrating St. Joseph's Day and or the equinox by burning old wood and rags. The northern end of the Plaza del Ayuntamiento is where the largest fire is located each year, belonging to the town hall. In 2014, it was a representation of Michelangelo's motives. I had visited the workshop on a trip the previous November, where he was under construction. During the fiesta, there are many parades in individual neighborhoods and centrally. And there's an enormous number of flowers. Over 2 days, up to 100,000 people in traditional costume take part in a flower offering parade, which ends in the Plaza of the Virgin next to the cathedral. And finally, fires are burnt on the night of the 19th. And here's Moses going up in flames. Floods were a serious problem for Valencia from Roman times, and on average, there's been one every 10 years. A catastrophic flood in 1949 led to a 1953 plan to divert the river to the south of the city, but no funding was made available. Then, in October 1957, 5,800 homes were destroyed or seriously damaged, and there were more than 80 deaths. The Plan SOR was approved in December 1961, and the work was done between 1964 and 1969, creating a new channel for the river about 12 kilometers long and 175 meters wide. It's usually dry, there to prevent the once-a-decade event. Here's a view from the train from Gandia, looking towards the port. The old riverbed is permanently dry, and after a plan for a motorway had been squashed, it has become a great asset for the city. The biopark, located towards the western end, is one of the world's best zoos. It replaced the city's old zoo in 2008. Much of the dry valley is a park with trees, gardens, play areas, sports facilities, and a cycle track. The Palau de la Musica opened in 1987. A glass dome, slender column, and an ornamental lake. There are 4 performance spaces and 2 exhibition halls. The most important feature of the dry riverbed, close to the seaward end, is of course the City of Arts and Sciences. There are 6 components. In order of opening, they are as follows. The Hemispheric, a giant 3D movie theatre with a 900 square metre screen. The Science Museum. The Umbracle, a wooded garden above the parking lot. The Oceanographic, a huge aquarium. The Palau de les Arts, usually referred to as the Opera House. And the Agora, a venue for convention, concerts, sports events, and exhibitions. Here's a general view to the west, with the Science Museum on the right and the Umbracle on the left. The Hemispheric is in the center, with the Opera House beyond. Umbracle. Hemispheric, with the Opera House beyond it, and the Opera House from one end and from the other. It contains 3 separate performance spaces. Looking east from opposite the Hemispheric, and here the Science Museum is on the left and the Agora is in the background. Between them is the suspension bridge which carries a main road. The Oceanographic lies beyond the Agora. It's Europe's largest aquarium and is made up of several different marine habitats. The architect for the City of Art and Sciences, except for the Oceanographic, was Valencia-born Santiago Calatrava. The Oceanographic was designed by Felix Candela, late in life, didn't live to see its completion. Aside from the eye-watering cost overrun, and they really were eye-watering, the budget had been 300 million and the final cost was 1.2 billion, 4-to-1. And there were problems with the complex, though not with Candela's Oceanographic. For example, mosaics began to fall off the Opera House, leading to expensive repair work, for which a lot of danger money was paid, I assume. Agora, here hosting a tennis tournament, has always been a disaster. It's been closed for most of its life. The retractable roof has never functioned, and the false ceilings and lagging are dangerous. Calatrava has also been involved in litigation in other cities in Spain and elsewhere over cost overruns, time delays, or buildings not being fit for purpose. His position seems to be that it's his job to produce some pretty pictures and that the construction process and the end result have nothing to do with him. He's reported to have said, "My work is limited to the aesthetic." While his buildings certainly are beautiful, on its own, that isn't necessarily enough. As far as the Agora is concerned, the Caixa Foundation has been contracted to revive it. A multi-purpose cultural centre, the Caixa Forum, is due to open next year. The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao was one of the inspirations for the development of the City of Arts and Sciences. And in Bilbao, it single-handedly revived the fortunes of a decaying city. It was designed by Canadian-American architect Frank Gehry and opened in 1997. Gehry's way of working was really quite different from Calatrava's. He insisted that he and his team retain responsibility for all stages of the project and brought it in on time and on budget. Ironically, about 400 meters upriver from the Guggenheim and completed at the same time, this bridge was designed by Calatrava. A beautiful bridge it is. The walkway is made of glass blocks, allowing the bridge to be lit from below. The surface is slippery when wet, and the city has had to compensate a lot of people for broken bones. And it's now covered by a grey non-slip carpet. And the city and Calatrava have had many days in court on a number of issues. The City of Arts and Sciences was not alone in creating a huge financial burden in the years leading up to the financial crisis. The vanity projects that make up Valencia's large herd of white elephants also include, among others, the city's hosting of Formula One motor racing and hosting of the America's Cup yacht races. They were hugely expensive ventures, and aside from being unjustifiable in principle, were marked by prodigious amounts of waste and corruption. These of course, are near the port, which is a short distance from the City of Arts and Sciences. Most of it is off limits, hard hat territory, but you can walk around the northern section, the Valencia Marina, where there are restored warehouses and office buildings, together with bars and restaurants. And the city's 4-kilometre long beach begins immediately to the north. And now the port from north to south is a distance of 5 kilometres. The Valencia Marina. This is all that remains of the enormous amount of infrastructure that was installed at great expense for the America's Cup. An elegant award-winning building with 11,000 square meters of floor space, it was the headquarters for the organizers, the teams, the sponsors, and various other hangers-on. Except for being the premises of an expensive restaurant, I don't think it gets a whole lot of use today. It overlooks the southern end of that 4-kilometre beach that I mentioned. So that's the Valencia story. To underscore the fact that it is an exceptionally interesting, beautiful and variegated city to walk around. And to complete the tour, I shall finish with a further selection of vignettes. Thank you very much.